The ballroom shimmered under the glow of extravagant chandeliers, the soft hum of conversation mixing with the delicate clinking of champagne glasses. Everything about the event was curated for excess. The marble floors polished to a mirror sheen, the floral arrangements so large they seemed designed to intimidate rather than impress, the menu boasting delicacies that few in the world would ever taste. This was more than just a gala. This was a display of dominance. The guests were no different. CEOs, Hollywood elite, politicians who operated in shadows rather than in office, all gathered under one roof, playing their unspoken game of influence. The true purpose of the night wasn't celebration. It was strategy. Deals would be made, alliances formed, reputations cemented, or in some cases, destroyed. At the center of it all stood Richard Caldwell, a man who had clawed his way to the top, stepping over anyone who had dared stand in his way. He had built an empire out of nothing, amassing a fortune that ensured he never had to hear the word no. To the public, he was a business visionary. To those who truly knew him, he was a man who thrived on power for the sake of power. And tonight, this was his kingdom. Richard moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands, exchanging smug grins with his peers, accepting flattery as if it were his birthright. His name carried weight, his presence commanded attention, and he knew it. This was the kind of room where people measured themselves by proximity to power, and he was the one they measured against. It was in the midst of this self-congratulatory haze that Richard's gaze landed on something out of place. A man sat quietly at one of the side tables, removed from the constant flow of networking and posturing. He wasn't dressed for power, wasn't adorned in wealth like the rest. No designer tuxedo, no flashy jewelry, no desperate need to be seen. Instead, he exuded something far rarer, effortless comfort. Richard's brow furrowed slightly. He recognized every face in this room. He had personally approved the guest list, made sure that the only people attending were those worth his time. So who was this? He studied the man for a moment longer. Dark hair, slightly tousled, a well-tailored but simple black suit, understated and devoid of the usual arrogance that filled this room. He wasn't a politician, wasn't a business mogul. He wasn't playing the game. Richard let out a quiet scoff. The man didn't belong here. And yet, something about the way he sat there, unbothered by the whirlwind of wealth and power around him, irritated Richard in a way he couldn't quite explain. His lips curled into a smirk. He would change that soon enough. Keanu Reeves had never been one for extravagance. He had attended events like this before, of course. Premieres, charity galas, the occasional industry party, but he had never needed them. The flashing lights, the whispers of wealth, the carefully constructed illusions of power meant nothing to him. And yet, here he was. A friend had invited him, someone he respected, and so he had accepted. Not because he needed to be seen, not because he had anything to prove, but simply because it seemed like a decent way to spend the evening. He had arrived without an entourage, without the manufactured presence that so many others in the room carried like armor. No personal photographer trailing behind him, no assistant whispering the names of important people in his ear. Just him, a simple black suit, and the quiet confidence of someone who had long since realized that real power wasn't measured by the cut of your tuxedo or the weight of your wallet. And that, more than anything, made him stand out. He noticed the glances, the way certain guests eyed him with curiosity, their perfectly rehearsed smiles faltering just slightly as they tried to place him. They knew the face, of course. They had seen him in films, heard the name whispered with a kind of quiet reverence, but he wasn't one of them. And that made some of them uncomfortable. Because in a room like this, everything was a transaction. Status was something to be flaunted, Conversations were calculated moves, and respect was only given if someone could offer something in return. Keanu offered nothing. He wasn't here to impress anyone, wasn't here to negotiate, wasn't here to seek approval. And in a space where approval was currency, that made him an anomaly. No one knew quite what to do with him. But one man, standing across the room, had already made his decision. Richard Caldwell had been watching him for a while now, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp. He didn't like uncertainty, didn't like people who refused to acknowledge the hierarchy he had spent years reinforcing. Keanu was sitting alone, not looking around for validation, not adjusting his posture to command attention. He didn't have to. And that irritated Richard more than it should have. Because power in Richard's world was something you projected. You didn't just have it. You made sure everyone around you knew you had it. And yet, somehow, without trying, without saying a word, Keanu was pulling the attention of the room away from him. Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't like that. And soon he would make sure Keanu understood exactly where he stood. Richard Caldwell had built his empire on power, control, and perception. He was the kind of man who didn't just walk into a room, he owned it. Every conversation bent in his direction, every smile was a carefully crafted performance of respect, and every interaction served a purpose. And yet, there was one man sitting across the gala floor who didn't seem to care. Keanu Reeves. Richard had recognized him immediately. Everyone knew who Keanu Reeves was. But unlike the usual Hollywood elites who attended events like these, Keanu wasn't playing by the rules. No desperate need for attention, no tailored suit screaming status, no entourage ensuring his presence was noticed. Just him, sitting alone, comfortable, at ease. And that irritated Richard more than it should have. It wasn't just the way Keanu was dressed. A simple black suit, nothing flashy, nothing custom-fitted to scream wealth. It was the way he carried himself. Like he didn't need this place. Like the politics of power and influence that everyone else spent their lives chasing were completely irrelevant to him. Richard's jaw tightened as he swirled the bourbon in his glass, watching from across the room as Keanu casually flipped through the event program. This wasn't how the game worked. In Richard's world, people had to prove themselves. Power was demonstrated through wealth, connections, dominance. Men like Richard didn't ask for respect. They commanded it. And yet somehow Keanu had entered the room and effortlessly drawn all the attention away from him, without even trying. That was unacceptable. Richard set down his drink with a quiet clink, his decision already made. He was going to fix this. It wasn't about Keanu's fame. Richard had spent decades surrounded by A-listers, politicians, CEOs worth more than entire countries. He wasn't intimidated by a movie star. It was about principle. A man like Keanu shouldn't be able to walk into an event like this, break every unspoken rule, and still somehow steal the room's attention. No, that wasn't how things worked. Richard straightened his jacket, adjusting the cufflinks that cost more than most people's mortgages, and made his way across the room. It was time to remind Keanu Reeves where he stood. The gala was in full swing now, the ballroom alive with the hum of conversation and the clinking of champagne flutes. Waiters in crisp white shirts floated through the room, refilling glasses and clearing away the remains of a dinner that had cost more than some people made in a year. The air was thick with the scent of wealth, expensive cologne, aged scotch, power disguised as elegance. At the center of it all, Richard Caldwell stood exactly where he thrived, under the spotlight. He had taken the microphone, effortlessly drawing the room's attention like he always did. This was his element, the place where he controlled the narrative. Every year, he made sure to deliver a speech that left people talking, whether it was a carefully placed jab at a competitor, a boast about a new acquisition, or a reminder of just how far ahead he was. But tonight, he had a different target in mind. His eyes flicked across the room, landing on Keanu Reeves, still seated at his table, still unbothered by the extravagance swirling around him, still refusing to play the game. Richard's grip on the microphone tightened slightly, his irritation masked behind an effortless smirk. Time to put him in his place. He turned back to the crowd, his voice dripping with the same casual arrogance that had made him feared in boardrooms across the world. "You know," Richard started, pausing just long enough to let anticipation build, "we have quite the guest list tonight. Some of the most powerful people in the country under one roof. Visionaries, leaders, the kind of people who understand what it means to succeed." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Flattery always worked. "But I have to say," he continued, his smirk widening as he glanced back toward Keanu, "I wasn't expecting such humble company this evening." A few chuckles. Uneasy ones. Keanu didn't react. Richard pressed on. "Don't get me wrong," he said, pretending to search for the right words. "I respect a man who doesn't need a $10,000 suit to make an impression, who doesn't need the latest Rolex or the kind of car that turns heads when it pulls up to the valet." More laughter now, some genuine, some forced. "But really," Richard continued, tilting his head, "I have to ask, what is a guy like you doing at an event like this? Did you get lost on the way to a coffee shop?" This time, the laughter was louder. Keanu exhaled softly, setting down his glass. The moment was balanced on a knife's edge. Some in the crowd were eating it up, eager for any excuse to laugh at the expense of someone else. Others, however, weren't so sure. The CEO was powerful, yes, respected, feared. But Keanu wasn't just some random nobody. He wasn't a washed-up actor looking for relevance or a social climber desperate for a seat at the table. He was Keanu Reeves. And while he had remained silent, his lack of reaction spoke louder than any insult Richard could throw at him. Richard, sensing that the crowd was still on his side, leaned in for the final blow. "Look, I get it," he said, mock sympathy dripping from his voice. "Not all of us measure success in private jets and billion-dollar deals. Some people prefer to keep it simple." More laughter, louder now. The ones who had chuckled politely before were more comfortable joining in. Richard turned back to Keanu, arms outstretched. "No hard feelings, right?" He expected a smirk, a nervous chuckle, maybe even some feeble attempt at a comeback. Instead, Keanu just smiled. Not out of embarrassment, not out of discomfort. It was something else entirely. And in that moment, Richard had the sinking feeling that he had made a mistake. Keanu took a slow sip from his glass, setting it down with quiet precision. He wasn't rushed, he wasn't flustered, he wasn't embarrassed. If anything, he looked amused. The laughter in the room was beginning to settle, the wave of mockery fading into awkward murmurs as people began to realize something wasn't quite right. Richard had expected a reaction. Anger, defensiveness, maybe even some forced humility. Instead, Keanu just leaned back slightly, meeting Richard's gaze with the same effortless calm he had held all night. Then he smiled. Not a smirk, not a sarcastic grin, just a quiet, knowing smile. And somehow that was worse. The weight of the room shifted. Keanu didn't need to match Richard's performance. He didn't need to make himself bigger, louder, more powerful, because real power didn't need to be performed. And then finally, he spoke. "That's a good question," Keanu said, his voice smooth, steady. He gestured around the room with a slight tilt of his glass. "What am I doing here?" The way he said it made a few people chuckle, not at him, but with him. The room, once fully on Richard's side, was already turning. Keanu exhaled, as if he had genuinely been considering the question. "You know, I've been to a lot of events like this," he continued, "and I've met a lot of interesting people." His voice was even, thoughtful. "Some of them are brilliant, some of them are generous, Some of them use their success to make the world a little better. He paused. And some of them... He smiled again, eyes locking on Richard, not with hostility, but with something softer. Well, some of them just like hearing themselves talk. A ripple of surprise swept through the room. Someone stifled a laugh. Another guest holding a glass of wine hid a smirk behind his sip. The balance was shifting faster now. Keanu wasn't fighting back, but somehow he had just made Richard's entire speech sound ridiculous. Richard's smirk twitched, his confidence faltering for the first time. He opened his mouth, maybe to fire back, maybe to regain control. But Keanu wasn't finished. "I get it, though," he said, nodding as if he were agreeing with Richard. "I'm not a billionaire. I don't own a hedge fund. I don't throw my name on buildings. So maybe I don't belong here." A few people shifted in their seats. Richard relaxed slightly, sensing an opportunity to regain control. But before he could cut in, Keanu continued. "But that's the funny thing about rooms like this," Keanu said, his voice quiet but impossible to ignore now. "People think money is what makes you important, that numbers on a screen make you better than the guy next to you." Silence. A few people glanced at each other. Keanu shrugged. "I don't buy into that." Another beat of silence. Then, a single sharp chuckle from somewhere in the back of the room. A guest near the bar, one of Richard's so-called peers, shook his head, grinning as if he had just realized something. And just like that, the shift was complete. The ones who had been laughing with Richard minutes ago, they weren't laughing now. They were watching, waiting, wondering if Richard would dare respond. But he didn't, because suddenly he was the one in the spotlight. And for the first time that evening, he didn't like it. The shift was almost imperceptible at first. A few uncertain glances, a murmur in the crowd, the sound of someone clearing their throat as if suddenly uncomfortable. The laughter that had once echoed through the ballroom at Richard's expense was gone now, leaving behind a silence that felt too heavy, too revealing. For the first time all evening, the crowd wasn't looking at Keanu. They were looking at Richard, and he could feel it. He had spent his entire career mastering rooms like this, boardrooms, galas, shareholder meetings, spaces where power was a currency, and he had always had the most to spend. He knew how to command attention, how to turn a phrase into a weapon, how to make sure that people left remembering his name, his voice, his influence. But right now, he felt something dangerously close to exposed. The worst part? Keanu hadn't done anything. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lashed out, hadn't matched Richard's bravado with his own. He had simply spoken, effortlessly shifting the narrative from a harmless joke to something that suddenly felt mean. And now, people were realizing it. Across the room, someone shook their head, muttering something under their breath. Another guest leaned over to whisper to their date, their expression somewhere between amusement and pity. A well-known investor, one Richard had spent years trying to impress, was watching the exchange with thinly veiled disapproval. Richard's stomach twisted. Number. He wasn't going to let this get away from him. He straightened his jacket, forcing a chuckle, trying to regain control. "Oh, come on," he said, flashing a too-wide smile that suddenly felt too forced. "It was just a joke. You can take a joke, right, Keanu?" But the words landed flat, because now no one was laughing. Keanu just smiled again, the same effortless, completely unbothered expression that was so much worse than anger. Richard's grip tightened around the microphone. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to losing. For years, his presence in a room had been enough to tilt conversations in his favor, to make people hesitate before disagreeing with him. People wanted his favor, his business, his approval. And yet, here was Keanu Reeves, a man who had spent the entire night ignoring the unspoken rules of power, quietly dismantling Richard's control over the room without even trying. Richard wasn't just losing this moment, he was losing the room, and he knew it. A ripple moved through the room, a slow, steady shift that Richard Caldwell could no longer ignore. At first, it was just murmurs, subtle shifts in posture, the way people started looking past him instead of at him. But then, someone spoke up, a voice from the crowd, a familiar one, sharp with disapproval. "Jesus, Richard," a man near the bar muttered, shaking his head. "You've really got nothing better to do than punch down on a guy who's done nothing to you?" Richard turned, recognizing Daniel Crowley, a venture capitalist he had shared many drinks and many backhanded conversations with over the years. Normally, Daniel was on his side. Normally, he'd be the first one to laugh, the first to feed off Richard's confidence. Not tonight. Daniel wasn't laughing. A few others nodded in agreement, quiet but unmistakable. Another voice, this one belonging to a well-known actress standing near the entrance, cut in, her tone unimpressed. "Kind of wild, isn't it?" she mused. "That a guy who could have literally anything still needs to put someone else down to feel important." Richard felt his throat tighten. No, this wasn't how this was supposed to go. This was his room, his crowd. He could feel his control slipping, not just over the moment, but over the people who once respected him. A billionaire in the crowd, one of Richard's longtime associates, let out a low chuckle, but not the kind of laugh Richard was used to hearing. It wasn't admiration. It was amusement at his expense. "You know what's funny?" the man mused, taking a sip of his drink. "I don't think I've ever heard Keanu say a bad word about anyone." He glanced at Richard, eyes sharp. "Can't say the same for you, though." Another shift, another blow. Richard's grip on his drink tightened. He could feel his pulse pounding in his temple. How had this gone so wrong? He had been winning. But now they weren't looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at him the way they looked at people who had been caught trying too hard, insecure, petty, desperate for validation. The very things he had spent his life making sure no one ever associated with his name. And across the room, Keanu Reeves was still sitting there, still completely unfazed, still refusing to fight back, because he didn't have to. Richard had already lost. And worse, he had done it to himself. Keanu sat quietly, fingers resting lightly on the stem of his untouched wine glass, his expression unchanged. He had watched the power in the room shift, felt the weight of the silence settle, but he had never needed to command it. That was the difference between him and Richard Caldwell. Richard had spent years manufacturing respect through wealth, through power, through dominance. He believed control was something you took, that admiration was something you could buy. Keanu, on the other hand, had never chased it. And that's exactly why he had it. The room waited, tension thick in the air. People who had once laughed at Richard's jokes now watched him with quiet judgment, waiting to see how this would end. Keanu exhaled softly, finally breaking the silence. His voice was calm, almost too soft for a moment like this. "You know," he mused, lifting his gaze toward Richard, not with anger, not with smugness, just quiet certainty. "I don't think this is about me." Richard flinched just slightly. Keanu smiled, but there was no malice in it. "I think this is about you." The words landed like a stone dropping into still water. Simple, unavoidable, irrefutable. And somehow they hit harder than anything Richard had said all night. Keanu leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. "You've spent this whole evening making sure everyone here knows how important you are." His eyes flicked briefly to the stunned guests around them before settling back on Richard. "But if you really believed that—" A small pause, the kind that stretched, the kind that suffocated. "You wouldn't need to prove it." Silence. Richard's face twisted for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the crowd to see it. A few murmurs rippled through the room, quiet but cutting. Someone near the bar let out a low, unimpressed chuckle. A waiter, clearing a table in the back, tried to suppress a smirk. Keanu didn't move. He didn't need to. Richard had spent the entire night trying to remind people that he was powerful. But now, standing in front of Keanu, in front of an entire crowd that no longer saw him the way he wanted to be seen, he had never looked smaller. Keanu sighed softly, shaking his head as if this entire thing had been a waste of time. Because really, it had been. He stood, smoothing out his suit jacket. The moment was over. He had nothing more to say. Without another glance at Richard, he turned toward the exit. And then, applause. Soft at first, then louder. It wasn't for Richard. It had never been for Richard. It was for the man who had never needed to humiliate anyone to prove his worth. Keanu didn't look back. He didn't need to, because he had already won. Richard Caldwell had spent years crafting his image. He had built an empire on the illusion of control, on the belief that power meant never being questioned, never being challenged. But by morning, that illusion was shattered. The first headline hit before sunrise. CEO tries to humiliate Keanu Reeves, instantly regrets it. It was everywhere. News outlets, entertainment blogs, business journals, they all had a version of the story. And the internet was merciless. Twitter exploded. Imagine being so insecure that you try to embarrass Keanu Reeves in public. Couldn't be me. Richard Caldwell just became the human embodiment of, this ain't aging well. Keanu. Breathes, Richard. How dare you outshine me? Meme after meme circulated. Screenshots of Richard's smug face compared to his stunned expression when the room turned on him. Clips of Keanu's calm, cutting response played on repeat. The internet had chosen a side, and it wasn't his. Richard tried to contain the damage, tried to act like it wasn't a big deal, but it was. His inbox filled with cancellation notices. Business partners suddenly re-evaluating deals that had seemed locked in just days before. Investors pulling out, citing concerns about his leadership and public image. He wasn't just being mocked, he was being abandoned. Even people who had once worshipped him, the sycophants, the opportunists who had clung to his success, were suddenly distant, because no one wanted to be aligned with a public failure. Richard stared at his phone, scrolling through the damage, headline after headline, tweet after tweet. His hands tightened into fists, the same fury from the Gala burning inside him. How had this happened? How had one man, one quiet, unassuming actor, managed to undo years of power in a single night? And then, with a sinking feeling, he realized the truth. Keanu hadn't done anything. Richard had done this to himself. He had been so desperate to prove his importance, so desperate to remind the world of his power, that he had shown them the exact opposite. He had become a punchline. And worse, no one felt sorry for him. Keanu Reeves never responded to the headlines. He never issued a statement, never acknowledged the viral storm that followed the Gala, never engaged with the endless commentary dissecting Richard Caldwell's spectacular fall from grace. Because he didn't need to. While the world picked apart Richard's humiliation, Keanu simply went on with his life. The cameras that had been waiting for some kind of reaction got nothing. There was no victory lap, no smug interviews, no behind-the-scenes leaks from Keanu's team. He just kept being Keanu. A week after the Gala, a blurry photo surfaced online. Keanu on the subway, legs crossed, book in hand, a quiet smile on his face. A comment under the post summed up the entire saga in a single sentence. Richard Caldwell spent his life trying to be powerful. Keanu Reeves just is. And Richard was drowning. The damage to his reputation wasn't temporary. The investors who had paused their deals never came back. The business partners who had distanced themselves found other connections. The board of his own company, once so loyal, began whispering behind closed doors. Not because he had made a single mistake, but because he had exposed himself. The industry could forgive arrogance. They could forgive failure. But desperation? That was fatal. And the worst part, the part that kept Richard awake at night, was that Keanu had never tried to take anything from him. Keanu hadn't fought back. He hadn't sought revenge, hadn't called for Richard's downfall. He had simply existed. And somehow, that had been enough to undo him. Because real power isn't something you take. It isn't something you can force or buy or intimidate people into giving you. Real power is what remains when everything else is stripped away. Richard spent his life desperately trying to hold on to it. Keanu had never needed to.